Today, as you know, we have um, Amanda Foreman, who is a graduate from Sarah Lawrence College. I learned this week it's the most expensive school in the country now.
Mm-hmm.
How, not when you were there.
No, it was the second.
And a master's and doctorate in history from Oxford University. She's the author of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, a bestseller that won the Whitbread Prize and was adapted for the screen as the Duchess. Her latest book, we have her here today, A World on Fire, Britain's Crucial Role in the American Civil War. It's 958 fascinating pages, $35. Amanda has 5 children, yet she's still got this book out. And the pace really never tires. It just keeps going. I first thought when I started getting into this book needed an editor. But every time I came across a new story, a new person, it just flowed on, and I just needed to know more about this particular event or person. So you're going to fly through this book and wish it didn't finish. Now, I should tell you, I'm a traditionalist. And when July 4th comes around, I try to find a Brit to kick out of the country. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in this book. But nonetheless, there's a lot to talk about here. Let's start out just, Amanda, with how did you get to this book? Why this book and why now?
Okay, well, the germ of the book came from actually my time at Sarah Lawrence. I arrived there just when the kind of PC wars of the late 80s and 90s were really beginning to explode. And Sarah Lawrence, being a good left-wing liberal arts college, got hit hard. And while I was there, this is, I guess, 88, 89, 90, there was a famous college sit-in, and it was closed down for 2 months. And it was actually quite fun in many ways. I mean, lots of chanting, placards, protests, and and some of the protests were usual stuff. The cafeteria was no good, whatever. But underneath it all was a very profound complaint, which the students classed under the label diversity. Now, I'd come from an English boarding school, so this idea of diversity was fascinating. I'd never come across it before, and I was interested to see what that meant. So I actually made a point of listening, really, to what they meant. What was this diversity thing? And I realized it wasn't actually an argument about the present. It was a very serious but somewhat incoherently expressed idea about the past, that the pain and anguish that a lot of these students genuinely felt had to do with a sense of disappointment or rage, anxiety, about broken promises from the civil rights movement, and actually going back to the Civil War. That yes, there was a lot of silliness going on, but actually there was something very serious, inchoate perhaps, but genuine and serious, about the history of slavery and civil rights in this country. So, after graduation, I went to Oxford in order to study that question from, as it were, a teleological point of view, from its origins. So I studied the abolition of the slave trade. That was my master's. And then I went on to begin a doctorate on attitudes to race and colour in 18th and 19th century England. And it was while researching that subject and looking at the politicians who had been big in the slave trade movement that I came across this extraordinary woman who had been the mistress of a politician, Prime Minister, called Charles Grey. And that mistress was the Duchess of Devonshire. And that became that book. But I'd always wanted to stay within my original subject. And while I was at Chatsworth, which was where the Devonshires had their family estate in northern England, the then Duke and Duchess of Devonshire gave me permission to look at absolutely everything. So I went through the archives from the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th Dukes. And it turned out that the 8th Duke of Devonshire had an extraordinary relationship with America during the Civil War, and in fact had witnessed several Civil War battles. And it all began when he was a young man, and he was the Marquis of Hartington at that point, so not yet the Duke. And it all began because he had this mistress called Skittles. And Skittles was famous for 2 things. and they were related. The first was that she drove a perfectly matched pair of horses. And the second thing was that these horses, and Skittles herself, were very expensive to maintain. And so the Marquis found himself getting into debt. And rather than, as it were, manning up to this problem, and perhaps suggesting to her that they economize, get rid of one of the horses, whatever, he just packed his bags one day without telling her and skipped town and went to New York. And he put himself in the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which he liked very much. It was one of the grandest hotels in the world. And he particularly liked what he called the vertical railway that took him from floor to floor. He'd never seen one of these before, and he liked it very much. And he also liked the room service that the hotel provided. I mean, obviously, room service was not unknown in Britain, but in the Fifth Avenue Hotel, when he requested his hot tea, it would be brought to him hot, which was a very novel concept, and he liked very much. So he was there for about 3 weeks, and there was a knock on his door one night, and he thought, well, this is just probably some more hot tea. So he opened the door without any trepidation, and it turned out that it was not his hot tea, it was Skittles, who had tracked him down and found him at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. So he was obviously delighted to see her, thrilled, marvellous, and assured her of his everlasting love and that she must go back to her hotel, pack her bags, and join him at the Fifth Avenue the following morning. So she went back to her hotel to gather her belongings, to join him in the morning, and in the meanwhile, he got on a train and went to DC. And while he was in DC, he went into the Willard's Hotel. He loved the Willard's Hotel. It was the nexus of power, lots of very interesting people there. One thing he didn't like, actually, was the gobs of spit, the tobacco spit, that was very much a habit of Southerners, and he'd never seen that before. I thought that was rather revolting. But anyway, he was enjoying himself at Willard's, and then after about 10 days, there was a knock on his door after lunch, and he opened it expecting it was his laundry, and discovered it was Skittles, who had now tracked him down to Washington to Willard's. And he, by this time, he'd made friends with a man called Colonel Leslie, and who was there, and they both said they were delighted to see her. Absolutely. She must obviously come and join him. She looked a bit suspiciously at that point. And so he said, well, look, come and join me for dinner. Come and join me for dinner. So she went back to her hotel. She started packing her belongings to join him for dinner. And meanwhile, Hartington and Colonel Leslie rented a canoe and paddled across the Potomac to Virginia, because Hartington thought, it was 1862, it was the middle of the war, and Skittles might get across the Atlantic. She might even get down to Washington, D.C., but it was unlikely that she'd be able to face down the pickets in Virginia, and he was quite right. She was left weeping on the banks of the Potomac, and he got down to Richmond, Virginia. And here's something even more powerful than Skittles had this incredible effect on him, seduced him, actually, and that was Southern charm. Within a week of being there, he'd gone from being pro-Northern, this is a liberal politician, liberal in views, liberal in opinions, liberal in his politics, he'd gone from being pro-Northern to pro-Southern. And when he went back to England, he became the unofficial spokesman for the Southern cause in Parliament. And he was the Under-Secretary of War, so this is a very powerful lobbyist for the South. Now the irony is that his brother, Lord Frederick Cavendish, remained resolutely pro-Northern. And the two fell out over Hartington's stance on the Civil War. And I thought, this is it. Here we have, in microcosm, the macrocosm of what was going on in America. Families divided by the war, families divided by different interpretations of freedom. Hartington believed that the South was fighting for the right to self-determination. Lord Frederick Cavendish believed that the North was fighting for the right of individual freedom, and that trumped a smaller nation's desire for self-determination. And these competing ideas of independence and freedom and the role of slavery within that seem to me to be a very important subject to study within the context of Britain's role.
What's the best way that slavery will end? And the discussions were, as you point out, if the North and the South separate, then international pressure would be put on the South to divest itself of slavery, or would the North winning be better for slavery to go away? Now, Viscount Garnet Wolseley was convinced that slavery would die in the South after independence, and that motivated him to support independence in the South. So, and Mason and Slidell also used this particular argument as well when they were in that independence would be a better way for slavery to go, even though, as you mentioned there too, that he was obfuscating that slavery was way too important for it to go away as far as the South was concerned. So talk to us about how the cabinet was looking at the North-South, whom to whether to recognize or not.
Well, I think that the question about when slavery was going to end is one of the most interesting facets of the argument in the war abroad. And you have to tease out the different strands to understand why other countries, including Britain, didn't see the role of slavery in the same way it was seen in this country. So first of all, you have to remember that the phenomenon of dog whistle politics existed then as it does now. So you say something and people hear something else. And so in this country, when Lincoln was talking about the Union, people also heard the abolition of slavery. But in Britain and in Europe, when Lincoln's speeches and words were printed, and they read that Lincoln said, this is a war for union, this is not about slavery, that is what they believed, that is what they heard, and that's what they accepted. And that allowed Southern propagandists to come in to a wide open playing field to say, the war is about the North fighting for empire and the South fighting for freedom. And those are extremely loaded words. And in Britain they resonated. And that's why people like Viscount Wolseley and others genuinely believed that once the South gained its independence, then it would deal with the slavery question. Now, that word deal is very important. You know, there's that wonderful black and white film, science fiction film that was made in the 60s, in which the aliens come to this country and they bring with them a book that's titled How to Serve Humans. And everyone thinks that it's a book about how to serve humans, and then at the very end someone translates it and they realise it's how to cook and eat them and serve them. And so it all depends on how you translate serve. And it's the same thing with this idea about deal. How the South going to deal with slavery? And there's a fascinating letter from the Southern ambassador to France, John Slidell, who had a long conversation with the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the premier social reformer and campaigner in Britain at that time. So involved in all sorts of good works, not just in improving the lives of children and miners and workers, but also in helping slaves, escaped slaves, freeing slaves. And Shaftesbury was pro-Southern because Slidell had convinced him that the South would deal with slavery in its own way once it had independence. And Shaftesbury said, well, couldn't you just make some sort of statement right now? And Slidell said, well, the thing is, it also has to do with states' rights, and so we can't really make a collective statement. It'll be up to each state. And Shaftesbury, who didn't really understand what that meant, said, oh, all right then, that's fine. And then just briefly, to give you an idea about how loony the British concept was, after Lincoln made his Emancipation Proclamation, it was published in England in January, the Southern Independence Association in England, which was the largest independence association, pro-Southern association in England, wrote to Jefferson Davis in Richmond saying, dear sir, now that Lincoln has made his Emancipation Proclamation, won't you do the same in Richmond? And the Southern Cabinet just read this and just thought that the British had lost their minds.
It's interesting because the anti-slavery Britain, which was leading it in the world almost at the time, here they were supporting many the slaveocracy in the South. But then again, I was thinking of the United States. How many dictators, anti-democratic dictators, have we supported over the years? Isn't this what superpowers do?
No, I don't. That's not a correct analogy.
Okay.
There is no parallel there. This wasn't about real politics. Britons weren't supporting the South because they wanted to see a divided America, for example, which
Was this retribution against the revolution?
No, of course not.
Okay.
Nothing like that. And in fact, in America, it's often been posited that perfidious Albion, those terrible Brits, supported the South or were pleased by the Civil War because they wanted to divide America because that would be a weakened state. And, sure, you can always find someone in some diary or some letter who's going to say that. I mean, I'm not going to say that no one thought that, but that's not what politicians felt. If you look at their diaries, if you look at, say, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, William Gladstone, who wrote and told his cabinet members, we cannot have a divided America. It will be much worse if you have two Americas, or possibly three if the Northwestern Confederation as well. Because, the traditional stance in America is an Anglophobic stance. So if you have two Americas, both, neither of whom are sure allies, it means that whenever Britain suddenly needs help or is fighting a foreign war, it can never be sure that one of those two Americas isn't going to stab it in the back. So you want one, because you only have alliance with one. Once you have two, you're always being forced to deal, and you're kept on the back foot. So no, they wanted a united America.
Of course, what about Canada? They were certainly fearful of Canada, or even parts of the Caribbean, being taken over by the United States. So that's certainly a part of their calculations and in how to approach America, and neutrality being their best stance.
Absolutely. I mean, Canada is somewhat marvelous because the Brits have this love-hate relationship with Canada. On the one hand, once you have an enormous territory like that, and it's British North America, you can't afford to lose it. It's part of the contagion theory. If you're the biggest power in the world and somebody takes a large chunk of your territory from you, there's a threat of contagion. So you have to maintain everything as it is. On the other hand, they found the Canadians incredibly ungrateful for the amount of money that was being spent on them in their defences, and they really wanted to find some way of shunting them off. And of course, designs on Canada, American designs on Canada, was about as old as America itself. And, Canada was always being invaded by either actual American soldiers in 1812, or by sort of, American militias. And so, it was a genuine fear.
I was just thinking of Quebec City being taken by Benedict Arnold. He tried, but didn't make it. And I once had the copy letter book to Washington, all the letters on his way up to try to get Quebec City. It had been stolen. $1 million item walking into the shop.
Oh no! I'm sorry. That sounds rather shocking. But don't forget, of course, that the burning of the White House in 1812 by British troops was in revenge for the sacking of Toronto, then called York. So,
And then it goes back before that too, I'm sure. There were, well, let me ask you first about the various British youth that came over. I mean, there's so many characters in this book, and it's fascinating that you've gotten them all together in here to see them and get the panoply of who was fighting and on what side and why. The average youth that came over, what strata of society did they come from? And were they fighting the same war that America was fighting?
It's very interesting. Well, I mean, there were over 200,000 Irish, and then there's 50,000 English, Scots, and Welsh. So, if you put them all together, it's going to be very difficult to come up with, major strands. I think obviously money was a very big one. Those bounties could really make somebody quite rich, especially in those days. A $400 bounty was enough to set you up for life, especially if you had nothing before. So that attracted a lot of people to go over, and they all fought for the North, of course. But that is by no means everybody. And there's certainly enough anecdotal evidence to show that idealism was a genuine motivator for quite a few young men, both for the North and for the South, and we have their letters. And not just young, I mean, colonels who were in the British Army who resigned their commission and then became colonels in the American Army, because one said because he felt that America was a great country and was ashamed to see it fall to pieces. So, I mean, and that's actually very heartening. And then young men who fought for the South, because they genuinely believed that this was a war for independence and self-determination. And those are magical words in Britain and have been for centuries, unless they're the country fighting for independence is Ireland, in which case somehow it's
Well, you talk in the book, you write about Henry Adams. So was he correct when he said the English mind took naturally to rebellion when foreign?
Yes. Oh yes, I think.
And that eccentrics went to the south? Was he correct on that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I love that passage, and he talks about who were eccentrics, and he realised it was practically everybody. It was everyone in the theatre, in Fleet Street, in the fashionable world.
William Seward, Henry Adams, Lord Lyons, a number of them. One of the British reviewers of your book said that Lord Lyons was the hero of the book. Yes?
Well, do you know what? That's actually Jay Perini, the US historian, who said that.
It was in a British
yeah, who wrote it in The Guardian, yes. And I think that there's a number of heroes, but some of the heroes are also anti-heroes. Actually, my favourite hero / anti-hero is Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who I think is a kind of marvellous monster sacré, and that the terrible, catastrophic mistakes that he makes at the beginning of the war and sometimes throughout the war are balanced by the heroic sacrifices that he also makes and the bravery he shows when all else around him, say over the Trent affair in 61, are taking the coward's way out, and he actually puts himself on the line. I think he is a genuinely great man, and in that greatness, unbelievably flawed.
Well, he came to England to get away from here for a while in 1860.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting relationship he had over there and what he learned over there. Of course, the Brits thought that he was going to be the next president.
They did, that's right. Seward came over to England in 59, and it was because of his speech, which had made him seem like he was some kind of terrible anti-slavery radical, and so he went to England to kind of get away from it all and hope everyone would forget. And over there, he did make quite a few friends. I mean, and it completely turned his head. I mean, he met everybody, and his letters back home were just appalling. It's such a terrible display of snobbery, and sort of sucking up to the aristocracy. And then when he met sort of genuine social reformers, like Harriet Martineau, for example, she was just appalled. She thought he was terribly cynical, and shallow in his commitment. And I think she was being unfair, but she didn't understand how American politics works, and so she wasn't impressed. And actually, when Seward left, there was quite a lot of sort of sucking in, like this, through clenched teeth about Seward, and they felt that he was slightly kind of bloviating and full of bluster, and they weren't quite sure that they liked him all that much.
Were they shocked that the Rube Lincoln got in?
Oh, well, they were really shocked. They were really, they didn't know who he was, and the British ambassador, Lord Lyons, wrote to London after his election saying, "Well, I've been asking around Washington about this man called Lincoln, and no one seems to know who he is. Apparently, he once split rails." So they were amazed. They were actually rather disappointed. They spent all that time, cultivating Seward.
Exactly, yeah. Now, did his diplomacy, when he was as Secretary of State, and certainly near the beginning of the war, was his diplomacy affected by what he had seen and heard in England?
I think it was. That's a very interesting question, actually, because when he came back, when Seward came back to the US, and after he'd failed to get the nomination, there was just before Lincoln took office, there was this visit by the Prince of Wales, and he went around Canada, he went around parts of the US. And it was tremendously successful and fantastic. And then there was a dinner held in northern New York, given by the governor of New York, and Seward went to it. And for him, it was just a sort of dagger in his heart, because he had expected to be the president-elect at this point. He had, and instead of going in as the great man who was going to be showing the prince around and sitting next to him, he was going in as the defeated politician. So he drank way too much. And he sat down next to the Duke of Newcastle, who was escorting the prince, and just, he began his bloviating, and he said, having been to England, I just know you're never going to go to war with us because you like us too much. So if we get elected into power, I can assure you that the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try and get up some kind of row with you because it will make us very popular, the Republicans, and I know that you're just never going to declare war on us.
Which British journalist reporting from America had the greatest impact in Britain, and what was that impact? Now, one of them, of course, was William Howard Russell, My Diary North and South. And this is an 1863 edition of the, edited down from the 2 volumes. And it's interesting. This is the second American edition we have here. Now, he was an observer and a journalist. Now, we just got in a book here in the shop of a Henry Jameson of the 10th Illinois Infantry. And in there, he describes in his memoir, which is published, Recollections of Pioneer and Army Life in 1911. And I'm going to read just a little bit and have you comment, because he saw Russell in Cairo, Illinois. And he wrote, and I'll do this kind of quickly because I'd rather hear you than this. While in armed possession of Cairo, we had a peculiar connection with the British government. English official opinion gave vent to its joy at our fancied dissolution. The London Times had already wiped the United States from the map of the world, declaring that the Great Republic is no more. In this vein, the paper sent W.H. Russell to spy upon our movements and troubles. From the first, he showed a marked fondness for the South and her leaders. He made a tour of the southern states, concluding with a trip up the Mississippi River, and then he came up to Cairo, where he looked at the raw levies of the government over. I can see him now, his insolent figure confronting us as we stood on dress parade. But where are their jibes now? I see pirate ships equipped with English guns and manned by English sailors, being built and fitted out in English shipyards. The destruction of our merchant marine on the high seas. The British corvette Deerhound standing in the offing to rescue Semmes and his drowning shipmates, fleeing like rats from the sinking Alabama. Is there anything in history more detestable than the conduct of the British government toward us during our struggle to save our national inheritance? From the 10th Illinois and Seeing Russell. Tell us the least about Russell and some of the other journalists and their impact.
Okay, that's a great quote. That was obviously written in 1864, and he's remembering seeing Russell in 1861. Russell's whole connection to the North is absolutely tragic. William Howard Russell arrived at the beginning of the war, and at that point he was the most famous journalist in the world. He was famous because of his reporting in the Crimean War. He had brought Florence Nightingale to the attention of the world. And he was also known for his strict impartiality. He wasn't at all a fabricator, or he was not at all partisan, and he was not afraid to criticize injustice or any kind of military atrocities by his own country or whatever. So people trusted his reports, and when he said that British troops behaved atrociously, people believed him because he could also say when he thought they behaved well. So he arrives in the US, and the first thing he does is he goes to New York. He's an Anglo-Irishman. He was born in Ireland, but had spent his life in England. Bit of a hard drinker, so he gets drunk with the St. Patrick's Society and makes a speech, a very drunken speech, in favour of the North, which gets reported all around the country and earns him a rebuke from the Times. He says, my God, if you keep on doing this, you won't be allowed to travel in the South, you won't be able to report on both sides, keep your mouth shut. So Russell agrees that he won't make any more speeches like that, and then he goes and he interviews everyone in the North. He nips down to the South to interview whoever he can in the South, and he is totally unimpressed by the South. He gets to Montgomery, Alabama, which is the original capital of the Confederacy, and he says it reminds him of a small Russian town in the interior. So not exactly, and he's appalled by the Southerners. First, he realizes that there's this great cult of gentility and chivalry and a kind of aping back to a kind of English squirearchy. And then he writes, he says, these people, they think that they are channeling the kind of glory of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. He says, but they're not actually. They are Spartans. And they live off the back of the helots. This is a kind of a warlike, barbaric society that and has a kind of a barbaric concept of slavery. So he wasn't that thrilled by the South, but the mere fact that he had gone down there incensed various people, including the Secretary of State William Henry Seward. So when he went back after his travels, he was already in trouble. How could he even do that?
Well, listen to Jameson.
Well, exactly. And then, of course, Russell reported on the Battle of Bull Run, and he was one of the very few journalists who reported it as he saw it. Now, he arrived slightly late to the battle, but as he prefaced, I didn't see the whole battle, but this is what I did see, and it includes the terrible rout in which he was almost killed in it. And this just made everyone furious. This is not what they wanted to read. They wanted to read something else. All the other northern journalists had written somewhat heroic reports. And then out came this unvarnished report. And because of that, he was hounded out of this country. And not only was that just a disaster for journalism, but it was a disaster for the North's reputation around the world. And it meant that no British newspaper would send another journalists to cover the war from the northern side. From then on, they only covered it from the southern side. The South welcomed all journalists, and so
that had an impact on what was happening in England.
Terrible, because most people were getting their news from the Times, and the Times' replacement was a man called Sir Francis Lawley, who became completely and utterly pro-Southern to an unbelievable degree, a shocking degree actually. He was so partisan that when Richmond fell in 1865, readers of the Times were surprised. I mean, they knew the South was having a hard time, but they didn't actually think it was about to fall, and they were genuinely shocked. And the Times just looked terrible because they had been misleading them all this time.
What about Punch?
Punch. Oh,
There are cartoons. You heavily illustrate your book with cartoons of the British Weekly. How was Lincoln and the Civil War in general viewed in the Punch cartoons, and did it reflect the pulse of the British people?
I don't think that satirical magazines, which Punch was one, are true reflectors of the pulse of the British people. It's like saying that The Onion reflects all of American sensibilities today. I mean, that's not the case. So, but that doesn't mean it doesn't reflect a very important, we might call educated opinion, the chattering classes. You wouldn't completely dismiss The Onion, and you certainly wouldn't dismiss Punch because it was read by everyone who quote unquote mattered in that day. And then you have to add in Henry Adams' prescription about eccentricity. And of course, Punch is always going to take both the fashionable point of view, but also the slightly quirky point of view. It's always going to be on the edge. Satire and avant-garde are quite kind of closely aligned. So this is not a snapshot of public opinion. On the other hand, it's a very, very important window into educated opinion. And what did it show? It showed that the British had begun to see Lincoln as not the defender of civil liberties, but the man who was actually bringing them down. The man who suspended habeas corpus. The man whose Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in rebel territories but left the slaves in northern territories still in bondage.
Not understanding the politics.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and how could they, and why should they, in many ways? But then, of course, you say, well, they should have done because they did enormous damage to the cause. But after the assassination of Lincoln, Punch was the only journal in modern history to publish an apology to its readers for getting it wrong. Which is absolutely remarkable. It has never been done before or since. They said, look, we were completely wrong. We were facile. We insulted Lincoln. We took the kind of easy way out. We took easy and cheap shots. We never bothered to look below the surface, and we're sorry.
Was this also a reaction about martyrdom? I mean, here in the United States, for that matter, martyrdom, there wouldn't have been an Abraham Lincoln bookshop without martyrdom.
Sure.
So the same thing must have happened.
Well, that was the catalyst.
Yes.
That was definitely the catalyst.
But did it whitewash the opinion that had come before in a way, that they now all came on board the train of Abraham Lincoln and his mythology?
Well, perhaps not quite in the same way, but I mean, I think yes, the the British are always terrible cynics, so they didn't quite get on the train, but they certainly got to the station.
All right. Maybe this is a moment to ask you now about British historians, you being one of them. Henderson and Fuller and Liddell Hart, all are classical Civil War historians. What special perspective, being on the other side of the pond, do these people and yourself bring to us in America about our own war?
Well, it's very interesting, of course, because these British historians, Henderson in particular, they seem to have brought with it a kind of an enthusiasm for strategy, and hence they helped to rehabilitate Stonewall Jackson's reputation long before he was rehabilitated and re-examined over here. And I suppose that just came out of the sort of Sandhurst school of thinking, the military school of thinking, that they were bringing their British preconceptions and concerns and looking at them looking at American history in that way. So it was very instructive, especially I think Basil Liddell Hart, who's great historian of strategy. But they also had a rather kind of narrow perspective. I mean, for them it was kind of pretty much the South, the South, the South.
He or she does not sign this question from outside in Webland, but we thank you for putting in an email to us. At what point in the war was it most likely that the British government might support the Confederacy, and what kept them from doing it then? Might bring into this the belligerent status that they put onto the South and what that did, and how did that concept come into this question?
Wow, okay. Well, they're kind of two completely different
they are
questions
but,
here. All right, so number one.
Meld them together.
Oh, okay. All right, so belligerent status. Right. Well, that is fascinating now because it's just not a question that people really debate or care about nowadays. And yet, if you go back to say the 40s and 50s and 60s, there's just shelves of this stuff about whether or not Britain, and actually it was really starting before then, but whether or not Britain was on the side of the South when it declared that the South had belligerent status, and was this some part of some terrible malign plan to bring down the North. And I'm afraid to say that Charles Francis Adams helped to start that, but so did William Henry Seward. And the answer is, well, no. I mean, and people like Alan Nevins and others have really effectively debunked this. But I mean, the truth is that when Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of southern ports, the concept of a blockade had international ramifications, and it required the world to take a stand. Did it recognize the blockade or not? And the only legal instance of a blockade was of one country blockading another. You could not have the city of Chicago declaring a blockade of the city of New York. That doesn't make any legal sense. But you can have America declaring a blockade, against Mexico, for example, if they're at war with each other. So when Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of southern ports, Britain had to decide, was it going to recognize this blockade or not? It chose to recognize that blockade, which one would argue was a point in favor of Lincoln in the North, but it could only do that by granting belligerent status to the South. What that did was it conferred the right of the South to raise money on the open markets and get credit, which is extremely important. It would be able to recruit from countries that hadn't declared neutrality, and a number of other things. It could be able to import arms, for example. But the most important was the right to get credit as an entity on the open markets. Oh my God! So all right. So this thing that Britain does, which is on the side of the North, now gets translated into this is absolutely outrageous. Britain has semi-recognized the South. So that rage against Britain didn't really help Anglo-American relations, and some people said, oh well, that's one of the reasons why Britain was thinking about recognizing the South in 1862. Actually, I don't really think it was. It really wasn't. I don't think it definitely wasn't cotton. Cotton didn't have anything to do with it either. Very often if you look at these things, you find that it's personality at the end of the day that's moving these things along. And so what are some of the personality issues going on? Why was Britain, and what does it mean by Britain? Well, it really means 13 men sitting around the round table in cabinet discussing the issue. And among those 13 men you have personalities such as William Gladstone, Chancellor of the Exchequer, who really wants to be Prime Minister. And he loves the idea of freedom. He was very much in favour of Italian independence, just adored Garibaldi. And then you have his counterpart, Sir George Cornwall Lewis, who is a Secretary of War, and he wants to be Prime Minister. And they hate each other. So you can be guaranteed that if one takes one position, the other will take the other position. So Gladstone was pro-Southern because he felt that it had the right to become independent, and so Lewis was automatically just viscerally pro-Northern. So you start to see how these things line up. And Lord Russell, who had started the war being pro-Northern, he was the Foreign Secretary at this point, suddenly became pro-Southern because the other side of his character, the part that liked to always be interfering and to be seen to be doing something, suddenly thought, gosh, I really must stop the bloodshed. The bloodshed is really terrible. And so he felt that he ought to make the North and South declare an armistice because he wanted to be seen as the angel of mercy. And these have nothing to do with Cotton or Anglo-American relations. These are sort of, the head case type thing, is it?
Talking about cotton.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And King Cotton and the manufacturing interests in Britain and Liverpool especially and Lancaster. And what was the role of cotton really?
Sure.
Between America and Britain, in British eyes at least.
Well, I think you framed it in the right way. What was it really? Because you get these sort of endlessly reductive comments, I can't stand actually, about it was all about cotton, and Britain supported the South because of cotton. And I mean, it's just when you look at the facts, it just doesn't hold up. So, for example, at the beginning of the war, the South had its best crop of cotton ever. They had shipped so much of that stuff over in 59 and 60 that there was actually a cotton glut. And British merchants thought that there was going to be a catastrophic fall in prices. And they were desperately worried. But what they were going to do, they had so much cotton, they couldn't sell it enough. And the price of cotton goods was going down like a snowball. I mean, it was just falling down. And so when the war came and the South declared that there would be an embargo of cotton unless Britain supported the South and recognised independence, there was these whoops of joy on the cotton exchanges in Liverpool and elsewhere. The South had inadvertently come to their rescue, which was just great, and so that's the first thing. And then, if you look at history, whenever countries declare embargoes of something against another country in order to force a particular behaviour, it almost never works. If you look at the OPEC oil crisis in the 70s, did it force America to not recognise Israel? No. These things, they don't work the way you want them to. So when a little small country, which happens to deal in slavery, threatens the biggest power in the world at that point and says, we'll bring you to your knees because cotton is king unless you recognise us, the reaction of that world power is to say, well, we'll see about that. Anyway, and they happen to have, warehouses groaning with the stuff. So, sure, they were worried about it. They weren't thrilled with it. But it took 18 months for the cotton glut to disappear, and then for there to be a cotton famine. And by that time, there was enough cotton, just enough, coming in from India and Egypt and other places, to sort of keep most mills going at half-time. And, of course, war is a great, for other people, of course, not for those actually in it, but war is, often financially lucrative, and all these other industries, wool, linen, arms, ships, weapons, tin, copper, you name it. They were doing fantastically well out of the war. So Britain's economy actually grew during the Civil War, didn't shrink, despite the loss of an industry that employed 1 in 5 Brits at the beginning of the war.
Mm-hmm. We talked about Canada. I just want to ask you briefly about this too.
Blame Canada.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Was their view of the war different than over in Britain?
The Canadians?
Yes.
The Canadians were, I think they were slightly viscerally more pro-Southern than Northern because of the repeated invasion attempts by people in the North. So they weren't that thrilled to begin with. And then there were many publicised stories of raids by unscrupulous bounty hunters who would just kind of nip across the lines, kidnap a few, unfortunate drunks from the local Canadian bar, bring them back, and then enlist them in the army. I mean, that happened quite a lot. So a lot of Canadians were really pro-Southern, and especially some ports like Halifax. But that didn't stop, thousands of Canadians also volunteering for the North. So, you know, the split.
Purloining them, isn't that just the same as 1812 and the sailors being impressed by Britain?
Sure.
It's
And
just coming back for that.
well, you know, in a way you could say tit for tat, but this time, you know, did Britain declare war in the North because of that? No, you know.
Now, Antietam.
Yes.
Both sides it was a pivotal moment.
Mm-hmm.
And both sides of the ocean were looking at what would be the outcome of this battle.
Yeah.
And they had trouble perhaps recognizing the South because the British cabinet, as you described, was on the cusp of whether to recognize or not, and there was a momentum toward that. Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation following it right afterward had to have an effect.
Yeah, it did. I think it had the opposite effect from what people think it did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for example, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was interpreted by a lot of people in Britain as Lincoln's last card. Mm-hmm. That this was an act of desperation. And
Here too, by some.
Well, yeah, exactly. So this wasn't you know, it didn't seem as though the North had really had much of a victory. But on the other hand, it didn't seem as though the South had much of a victory, and the British were much more concerned about the ongoing bloodshed and whether they had a humanitarian issue on their hands, rather than this was some kind of, you know, tactical decision they needed to make on the basis of who was doing well and who wasn't. The argument that, you know, the South had managed to keep the North, you know, off its back for so long, including with Antietam, and therefore deserved recognition, didn't wash, because, as the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, said, well, look, you know, if the South is doing so well, and, you know, and Antietam is part of that, then it doesn't need our help in getting recognition. It's going to win independence anyway. And if the South isn't doing very well, and Antietam is proof of that, then why should we weigh in and help them? It's not up to us anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a cast of thousands in here, as I've mentioned. Let's just talk about a couple of them just to let everyone know what they're in store for here to get in. John Bright and Richard Cobden. Why do they become members of the United States in Parliament, in the House of Commons?
That's right. These were two radical MPs, Richard Cobden and John Bright. And Cobden had actually gone to America. Bright never actually visited America, but Cobden had. He'd even once gone down the Mississippi in the company of Jefferson Davis. So, you know, he knew quite a few of the politicians involved during the war. And they really admired aspects of America. Its democracy, its free education, its classlessness. What they despaired of is they hated it when things like the moral tariffs were enacted, because they were free traders. So as long as America had a free trading system going, they were thrilled. It upset them when the Republicans came in and started enacting all these tariffs. And this, but you know, they were so pro-American, it just infuriated people in England, and so that's why they were called the members of the United States. And you know, Bright's bust was on Lincoln's mantelpiece in the White House. Oh yeah, no, they were. Of course, the terrible irony is that John Bright had a constituent called Alfred Rubery. He was a young man, he was 21, and he was sort of rich and also exceptionally stupid, a bit of a nincompoop actually. And he wanted to kind of get rich, even richer, even quicker. So he went off to California to get involved in some kind of gold thing, and got caught up with somebody called Ashbury Harpington, who had this wild scheme to go out there on a boat and intercept the gold that was coming from California to New York, capture it, and then haul it off to the south. And so he persuaded our friend Alfred to buy a ship, turn it into a raider, and then go off on this enterprise. And of course they were caught within about 5 seconds of doing this. And so Rubery ended up in prison, and he was as guilty as sin. And yet, because he was a member of Bright's constituency for Manchester, his parents persuaded Bright to write to President Lincoln and get him released. And so he did. And of all the prisoners of war who deserved it, he absolutely did not. You know. So poor old Bright.
Another interesting fellow in your book is Henry Hoates. Confederate agent. Did I pronounce him correctly?
Well, I've always called him Hoots. I've asked people from Mobile, Alabama, where he was from, and they often say it's Hootsie.
I can see that.
Yeah, I see that too. So I think it's up for grabs still, to be honest.
Well, I think he's a wonderful story, and he's allied in your book also with another good story, Judah Benjamin. Tell us about Henry a little bit.
I love Henry Hertz. I really think he's the Goebbels of the 19th century propaganda. I really do. I mean, this man was a master at it, shockingly so. And I think that there are things that one can learn from him today. So just give you just one little aspect of what he could do. He, when he arrived in England, he made a study of all the main politicians in government and out of government. He then studied who their friends were and who their friends of friends were. And he just very slowly and discreetly kind of worked his way up, making friends of these friends and getting invited to things. Was always very generous, handing out cigars, this and that, And then whenever he met the new person, the target, before he met them, he would make a study of everything about them, their previous speeches, their likes, their dislikes. And in this way, he finally got to sit next to Gladstone, who was one of his main targets. And before he'd got there, he had studied every speech that Gladstone had made in the last 6 months. And so he began the conversation over dinner in a very general way, talking about tariffs and currency reform and this kind of stuff, things that he knew Gladstone was really interested in, and he knew that exactly the kinds of things that make Gladstone really happy. And so by the time he kind of got him where he wanted him to, then they moved into the South and what the South would do, and Hotz just spun this whole line of what the South was going to do with its economy, which miraculously just jived with exactly Gladstone wanted for England. And then Hotz reports that by the end of dinner, they were discussing not whether or not the South ought to be independent, but where the line ought to go and whether it should include, Virginia and Delaware as well, So he was just very good at it. So yeah, I love Hotz because he's the great evil genius of the book.
How did he get allied with Judah Benjamin?
Well, I mean, it was Benjamin who sent him to Britain in the first place, and had him set up something called the the Southern Commercial States Agency. It's one of those kind of bland names, like kind of CIA, whatever, And it's just basically nothing to do with commerce, and everything to do with propaganda.
Here's a question that just came in real late here. With only a couple of generations separating the War of 1812 and the American Civil War, surely there was some feelings of irony in having British civilians becoming involved in the U.S. war.
Well, irony, yes. I mean, I think there was. And one of the things that Britons who fought in the war reported back was they were really surprised when people brought up the War of 1812 and said, gosh, are you still feeling really upset about having lost that war? And first of all, the Britons didn't think they had lost the war. So that was a bit of a surprise to them. And then they'd be even more amazed when they sort of discovered that it was Andrew Jackson who'd won the war. So yeah,
after the war was over.
Yeah, after the war was over. So yeah, I mean, because the War of 1812 was just considered so insignificant compared to the Napoleonic War that was going on at that time. Just they found it all very odd.
All politics is local.
Yeah, clearly.
I'm going to put you to work signing a few of these while I just thank some of the people who have purchased books, and we thank you for that because it helps us bring in wonderful authors like Amanda and others, and having the publishers bring and send them here to us. Mark in Williamsburg, Virginia. Robert in New South Wales, Australia. The Smith family is always in Longwood, Florida. Paul in Kearney, New Jersey. Dennis in Gilbert, Arizona. Garrett in Palmdale, California. Roger in Glen Ellen, Illinois. Matthew in Chicago. Come in next time if you can. Harold in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Gary in Shreveport, Louisiana. James in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. David in Rosemont, Illinois. Charlotte in Kansas City, Missouri. Stephen in Durham, North Carolina. Stuart in Littleton, New Hampshire. Roy in Lebanon, Tennessee, and there are others. I want to get to another question or two, so forgive me for not naming everybody, but we appreciate it. Since I'm doing this before this next question, is let you know a little bit of upcoming virtual book signings that we have. Friday, November 11th, coming right up at the Union League Club for lunch, and reservations can be found on our website. Elizabeth Leonard, Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky. It's a fascinating book. I've already delved into it. And she'll be here on virtual book signing Saturday, November 12th, the next day at noon, along with Gail Stevens, Shadow of Shiloh, Major General Lew Wallace in the Civil War. So two, Holt and Wallace, who were both involved in the assassination conspiracy trial, will be featured. We're going to be at the Lincoln Forum, Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, on November 17th in Gettysburg. And Mark Neely has consented to come and sit with us with his new book, Lincoln and the Triumph of the Nation, Constitutional Conflict in the Civil War. There can be signatures only, no inscriptions, but if you would like to have Mark sign a book for you while he's in Gettysburg, we'll have them shipped here and then we'll ship them out to you. We need to know fairly soon. So get on our website and get this book. It's on the constitutional conflict. So this will be a fascinating book. And you know Mark is a Pulitzer winner, so this is going to be something. Friday, December 9, at the Union League Club again for lunch will be James Robertson. Bud is known to many of us. The Untold Civil War, exploring the human side of war. And then the next day, again, you can make your reservations on our website for the Union League Club for lunch on December 9. December 10th, Saturday at noon, Bud will be here again for his Untold Civil War, and paired up with Keith Dixon, Studying Southern Identity, Douglas Southall Freeman, and the Memory of the Modern South. Then Saturday, January 7th, we're getting into next year, but we want to let you know that we're going to have the American Historical Association's National Conference will be in Chicago, and we're going to have a number of the authors and historians that are there come into our shop. Brooke Simpson will be here with Victors in Blue with Albert Castell. And after Simpson, we'll have James McPherson, come in with Vernon Burton. These are essays in a book called The Struggle for Equality, essays in honor of James McPherson. And we'll have him here signing the book, along with a couple of the, I was going to say conspirators, but those who also contributed, is what I wanted to say, to that book. So you can go on our website, and we have all of this there for you, so you can see it, and we hope that you will come with us to these and be with us here. Another interesting person in your book, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to earn a medical degree here in the United States, and you end the book with her in her praise of Lincoln's leadership, that she didn't especially believe in at the beginning, and how she was now, post-war, thoroughly Republican.
Yes, meaning not that she voted for the Republican Party, but that she no longer believed in the monarchy. Yeah. Exactly.
And how was she, as you call her, the quintessential British American? You should know a little bit about this as well. And how did her quote apply to both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, Elizabeth Blackwell was born in Bristol in England, and she lived there as a child. And then when her father went bankrupt, they moved to the US. And she had her adult education in this country. She was educated at Geneva College, where she got her medical degree. The undergraduates were actually allowed to vote on whether or not they would allow a woman to study medicine. And as a prank, they voted yes, not actually thinking she would turn up. And she did, and then she was ostracized for the next 4 years. No one ever spoke to her in those 4 years. And it's made her into a slightly kind of monstrous figure, actually. She was a bit like Margaret Thatcher, that the struggle to get there was so great that she became naturally quite aggressive and single-minded and could never be turned from her purpose, which was great if you want to become a doctor and, you know, there are obstacles against you, but not so good for your family, who she absolutely rode roughshod over, and even forced her younger sister into becoming a doctor who never actually just wanted, all she ever wanted to do was just get married and have children, and found herself becoming a doctor as well because Elizabeth made her. And but she was an extraordinary woman who then trained at St. Bart's in England, trained in France, went back and started the first women's hospital in New York, the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, where she trained nurses for the Civil War. That's what she did during the Civil War. She trained these nurses and 1 or 2 female doctors before going back to England after the war and having a professor in gynecology in London. So she is the quintessential British American.
Mm-hmm. And a fascinating woman in her right. I'm going to ask